Happy Migraine Awareness Month, everyone. I hope you're enjoying everything we've had so far. It is RK from Migraine Australia again, and I'm really enjoying getting to talk to so many interesting and inspiring people as part of our Thriving with Migraine interviews. Some of the people we're talking to are doing really inspiring things for the migraine community, and our next guest is a very good example of that. Distinguished Professor Lyn Griffiths is a world expert in migraine genetics, and we're very proud that she's here at QUT in Brisbane. Thanks for joining us, Lyn.
I'm very pleased to join you.
All right, tell us what you do at QUT.
So I head up a centre in genomics and personalised health, where we try to identify the molecular basis of various human genetic disorders, and from that to develop better diagnostics and better treatments. One of the areas that I personally focus on as a researcher within that centre is on the molecular genetics of migraine. So we try to identify the genes that play a role in migraine, all the different types of migraine, and then we can use that to diagnose the disorder better, but also to give us clues about new forms of treatment that we could potentially develop.
This is really important work. So how many genes have you found so far? Because I know there's heaps of them.
There are quite a number of genes, but there are two different categories of genes for migraine. There are those that cause migraine. They tend to be the more severe subtypes of migraine that run very clearly through families. And for those, we have identified a number of causative genes, so genes that have mutations in them. And if you have that mutation, you definitely have that type of disorder. This is particularly true of familial hemiplegic migraine. This is a type of migraine. It's a type of what's called migraine with aura, but it's inherited in a very clear dominant fashion through families. So if you have it, all your children have a 50% chance of having it. It also tends to have a really young age of onset, and it also has not just typical migraine symptoms, which is the severe headache and nausea and vomiting and all that, but it also has paralysis, usually on one side of the body, severe weakness, and it's episodic. You can get it very, often. You stop having it, then you get it again a bit later. Quite often it'll be onset in children because it's very severe. Very hard to diagnose and to determine whether this is what you've actually got, a type of migraine, or whether it's something more serious like a brain problem or a stroke or something along those lines. So diagnostics for that are very important, because if you know the genes that cause it, you can do a DNA test and see whether you've got it. So at the moment, there are 3 well-known genes. There's probably about 3 or 4 others that play a role in that disorder subtype as well. And we're currently doing research to identify the other genes involved in this severe subtype of migraine. That's the causative ones. But there are also variations in genes that play a role in susceptibility. So this is what we call the more common variants associated with migraine. And one of the more recent studies that came out showed that there were 44 different loci or different genes involved in the more common types of migraine. I expect there are more. So
most of those,
how many there are.
There's lots, right? But are most of those genes related to the ion channels in the brain, or are they related to different things as well?
The first ones I mentioned are definitely ion channels, so not IRON, but ion, ION. So they relate to the movement of small chemicals across the brain, and that's why they're called ion channel genes. And the familial hemiplegic migraine ones are definitely ion channel genes. The 3 known ones is a calcium channel gene, an ATP, which is an energy storage molecule, and another is a sodium channel gene. For the other ones, the more common types, most of them are not necessarily ion channels, but they're things that can affect ion channels. They're genes that are expressed in the brain that may have effects on ion channels or on neurotransmitter releases. So all of them have something to do with the normal functioning of the brain.
Okay. So your interest in migraine genetics, did that come from being someone who lives with migraine yourself?
Yeah, I've definitely lived with migraine since I was a teenager. Probably a bit of history about my family. When I was a child growing up, my mum had migraines very badly as well. So she would be in very bad shape for several days. She would have to go to hospital. She quite often had some really horrible medications because the pain was just so bad for her. As I got a bit older into my teens, I started getting them as well. Just get these really dreadful pain, but also the strange, I suffer from migraine with aura, so the strange disturbances that you get before the head pain. So flashing lights, wavy lines, tunnel vision, all of those sorts of things are part of the aura. I would get that. I would have trouble talking properly in that early stage of a migraine as well. And, I was only like 13 or 14 and I didn't really know what was going on, but it would happen often. You never really knew when it was going to happen and you would have to try and deal with it. And sometimes it could go for 2-3 days with severe pain, couldn't stand bright lights or loud noise, felt sick in the stomach, if not actually throwing up. And it's just kind of hard to function normally as a teenager or as anybody, I expect, when you have that. So it started in my teen years. It's very bad in my 20s as well. But in my 30s, it was starting to get a little bit better. I had children at that stage too. And I kind of thought it was something you just have to deal with. You have to get on with your life and you have to do things anyway. So I was sort of dealing with it. But I was at that stage, I had made up my mind to be a geneticist or a molecular genetics person. I was doing my PhD in my late 20s, 30s, getting through that quite well. But when I had children, particularly about the age of 4 or 5, when my son was 4 or 5, he started getting really bad. And the reason I knew it was that he could describe it to me and say, the whole world is shimmering and there's bright lights everywhere and I can't see properly. And he was, feeling sick in the stomach and not wanting to go out and play. And, most 4 or 5-year-olds are pretty active and they can get out there and they want to do things. And this wasn't normal for him. So I knew enough about it to know he's suffering from migraine. And that's when I thought, why aren't people looking at migraine? It's obvious that it runs through families, because I'm not the only one. Everybody will talk about someone else in their family. Most cases, someone else who's affected if you are. So I started thinking, I've got to do something about this. I'm a geneticist. I should be looking at migraine. So shortly thereafter, I started a study collecting samples from people who suffer from migraine so I could look at their DNA and compare it to people who didn't.
And how
it
much?
wasn't me that started, it was him, actually.
Actually, we've had a number of stories through Migraine Awareness Month of people who live with migraine themselves, but it was actually their kids that really pushed them to go and do something, and particularly so young. My heart always breaks. When they're
I must say, my daughter, I have 2 children, and my daughter was very much like me. Around about her teens, she started getting it, and she didn't have them earlier. But she was a very good netball player, and she would just have days when she just couldn't play. It would, for whatever reason, her migraine would be triggered. She'd be an absolute mess. She couldn't go and play in her representative teams, and life was all very dramatic when that happened to her, and very disappointing, because you work with the team to play well, and then find that you get one of these horrible things, and she couldn't compete. So, unfortunately, everybody in my family gets migraine.
we do feel for you, we empathize, we know your pain. Tell me, when you first started doing those initial studies, was there much around on migraine genetics?
We actually did the first migraine genetic study in the world. Nobody had, people had looked at epidemiology, had seen that it runs through families, and they'd done things like look at twins to see that, but they hadn't started looking at genes. And so it's the first molecular genetic study. And we started off in, I think that was published in 1995, was the first one we did. So it took a couple of years to collect enough samples from migraine affected and unaffected controls, and then to develop the methods and decide which genes to start looking at. But we started off looking at serotonin-related genes. And then we also collected some large families to see if we could track through the families what particular chromosomes might be involved, and that's called a linkage approach. And so we had a couple of studies published quite early on showing different chromosome regions that were implicated in migraine, and these were the early studies on migraine. There's subsequently been other groups around the world, but I think we were right up there at starting this work.
Pretty groundbreaking stuff. So how do you manage living with migraine yourself and groundbreaking research? Well, how do you balance those two?
It is hard. There's no question. I mean, people who suffer from migraine know that when you get a bad migraine, you just can't function normally. So you just have to step out of the world sometimes, and you don't have a choice on that one. there's been times, where for several days, you'll just have to be 2 or 3 days, you're just out. I'm sorry, I've got a migraine, I'm out. And I'm not the only person. There are many people who suffer from migraine who do that. I mean, currently I have a lab. There's about 20, 25 research people in my team. And there's always one or two, as you expect, who suffer from migraine. So I understand them, and I understand that if they've got a migraine, they've got a migraine, and they can't turn up for a lab meeting, or they can't do the stuff in the lab that they were planning to do that day. I don't know if everybody understands migraine if you don't suffer from it yourself, but I certainly do. And I know that you try your darndest to work through things too, but it's not always possible depending on how bad it is. But I will say one thing though, and this is a bit astonishing. I found that the older I get, the easier the migraines get. There tends to be less of them, and they tend to be not as severe as they were. Certainly in my teens and 20s, they were dreadful. They were just devastating, and you couldn't do much, and that was it. But I found as I've got older, so there are some benefits in getting older, they don't seem to be as bad as they used to be, and they're not as frequent or severe. So that's a good thing. So I cope pretty well, but that's not to say that I don't still get migraines, because I do. There's still some, particularly the aura I've found tends to have got worse as I've got older. Sometimes it's incredibly bad. It'll go for about quarter of an hour to half an hour. And I've had situations when I've actually been giving a lecture and I couldn't see anything. The tunnel vision got so bad in both eyes that I just had to try and remember what I'm talking about and what's in that PowerPoint. Yes. Or when you're not, as I mentioned, when you, I get a problem with speech too, so it's difficult to talk sometimes because of that. So, yeah, I won't say it doesn't have a big impact on your life, because it does.
Did you find a treatment program at any point that worked for you?
Yeah, in my case, I must say there weren't so many good treatments when I was in my 20s and 30s. It was mostly painkillers, and I just found that you had to take a pretty serious one, and you had to take it early.
Yeah.
If you left it later, it really didn't work well. I found different things for different people, but again, that early thing is terribly important. With my daughter, early aspirin did wonders for her. With me, it tended to be something more that knocked you out a bit more. It's like a Masindol in those days. I think there were some studies that we were involved in as well that showed vitamin B levels can be helpful for some people as well, and we did some trials on that. So I must say I still tend to take a preventative dose to make sure that there's enough vitamin B in my system, and I get a bit worried sometimes if I've forgotten that, because I think maybe that it's not 100% guarantee, but I think it reduces things a little bit, so that helps. But yeah, I didn't really get into the triptans or to the monoclonals. They're the more recent ones. And as I said, luckily, I personally don't have as many migraines now. So that's pretty good.
It is pretty good.
I still get them.
It gives me hope. Although
Well,
I've done really well on Aimovig, but every now and then one breaks through and it's kind of like, oh yeah, they're still there.
That's right.
All right. So what do you think is going to be the next big thing for migraine genetics, or for you as a researcher?
Well, at the moment, I suppose in the past, DNA sequencing has always been very expensive. And as time has gone on and technology's got better, it's got a lot cheaper than it used to. So previously we used to have to kind of guess as to which group of genes we thought might be worth investigating. Now you can be a lot more comprehensive about it, and you can start looking at all of them. I think that comprehensiveness is really going to make a big difference. And so what we've been doing now is what's called whole exome sequencing. And that means you look at all the genes at once from people. So we're currently doing that with the very severe types of migraine. I think we probably have the largest cohort in the world for these very severe types of migraine, because we've been diagnosing them since 1997. So quite a big group. Probably about 20-25% of them we've been able to diagnose and say, okay, in your case and your family, it's this particular gene. But you'll notice that means 75% of the time we can't do that. So those are the ones that we're focusing on now. And we're doing whole exome sequencing, and we're collaborating with 2 other groups around the planet, one from Denmark and one from the Netherlands, with some other cohorts. And we're putting our results together to try and track down what genes and classes of genes there are apart from the known one. So I think that will really add to the diagnostics of these severe types of migraine. And I think that will give us clues to look at the genes for the common types as well. So I still think there's a lot to go in terms of diagnostics, and that will help us to develop better treatments if we know which particular one it is for you. It won't be just everybody getting the same treatment. It'll be tailored or personalized.
Which is the way that a lot of medicine is going, but we're just not at the first rung of getting stuff that works.
Yeah, but I think starting to use this genetic information will make a difference for all sorts of disorders, not just migraine as well. If you know what your specific background is, you can tailor the treatments to be more appropriate for you.
Yeah.
And so I think that's going to be the big thing in the future.
All righty, Lyn, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for everything you do for the migraine community.
Oh, look, I think it's a pleasure working on migraine. I'm just hoping we can make a difference to all the little kids that start developing it, and the teenagers in particular as well. And thank you, because I know you suffer as well. It's a big thing to make sure we all keep doing something, isn't it?
Absolutely. Let's all just keep working together.